welcome our speaker, Colin Hodgetts, whom I've known for goodness knows how long, since the 1980s. And we speak in the ultimate dimension about I am only here because you are here and everything else that brought us here. But in fact, in the historical dimension, Colin is completely responsible for me being here in this capacity. Because in 1988, when we were on a camping trip in France, he came back from the village one morning and said, "Anybody fancy an audience with a Zen master?" And that was it. We drove up to Plum Village to be welcomed very warmly because Colin had done some work. Colin and his wife, Julia, mustn't forget Julia, had done some work with Thay in the 70s in helping Vietnamese refugees to settle. And so we had a quite amazing weekend as guests at Plum Village. And I've been caught ever since, which makes me very happy now to welcome Colin to our morning of mindfulness, especially on Easter Sunday. So we're going to begin with just a short guided sitting meditation before the talk. And then after the talk, there'll be a chance to ask live questions from Colin. Then we'll have a break and a chance to share. And then after that, a chance to come back together for goodbyes. So we'll begin with just a short 15-20 minutes guided meditation. And I'm going to offer you as well, in a kind of nostalgic sense, the very first meditation I experienced on my first retreat, which happened about 3 years after we'd been to Plum Village. And I remember when I was first heard the words, I see myself as a flower. I immediately started thinking, oh, what flower shall I be? Shall I be a rose? Shall I be this? Shall I be that? What do they mean, see myself as a flower? I mean, have I got to be thorny or prickly? Or so all sorts of thoughts went on. And then I learned that in a guided meditation in our tradition, we're invited not to think or analyze about the words at all, but simply to carry one word on our in-breath or phrase, a word or phrase, and a word or phrase on our out-breath, and just allow the words to penetrate into our consciousness without trying too hard or wondering what they really mean. So if you would like to just settle yourselves into a comfortable sitting position, and I will invite the bell 3 times to begin, and then we'll enjoy some sitting meditation together. Breathing in, I am aware that I am breathing in. Breathing out, I am aware that I am breathing out. Breathing in, breathing out. Breathing in, I see myself as a flower. Breathing out, I feel fresh. Flower, fresh. Breathing in, I see myself as a mountain. Breathing out, I feel solid. Mountain, solid. Breathing in, I see myself as still water. Breathing out, I reflect all that is. Still water, reflecting. Breathing in, I see myself as space. Breathing out, I feel free. Space, free. So, dear Sangha, I can now pass the mic over to Colin for the talk this morning. And we will follow the talk with a period of questions and answer. So, Colin, thank you for being here, and I look forward very much to hearing your talk.
Thank you, Terry. Well, today, as we know, is Easter Day, when the Christian Church celebrates the resurrection. But we can't understand what is going on without going back a little. As the Quaker William Penn said, no cross, no crown. A very succinct way of putting it. So let us go back a week to Palm Sunday. And we have a group of people who have come down from the north, disciples and friends of Jesus, and they are about to enter Jerusalem. And they are waving palm branches and laying down branches in front of Jesus, who is on a donkey. And this is a prophetic act. The Jewish prophets used to act out what it was they wanted to say to their society. And what Jesus is doing is taking a saying from one of the prophets and acting it out, not arriving as a king on a horse surrounded by soldiers, but on the humble beast of burden, the donkey. And this will have been a little bit upsetting to the authorities. Firstly, the religious authorities would have understood the symbolism of this street theatre. But also the political authorities would have understood that from the north came trouble. Over 70 rebellions against the Romans were initiated, most of them by people from the north. It would be like the Scots arriving in London to protest about the fact that the government wasn't going to give us independence. There would be quite a fear in London as to what might happen when these kilted people playing bagpipes entered the city of Westminster. And we know how frightened they are about these sorts of things, because at the moment they are discussing how to prevent Black Lives Matter and rebellion extinction from holding their protests. In fact, comparing them to the behavior of the IRA. And if that happens in our country now, we can only suppose that in Palestine 2,020 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, the authorities would not have been very happy about the arrival of this group of people from the north arriving and making a demonstration at the gates of the city. So the authorities would already be worried. The religious authorities become even more worried when Jesus enters the temple and throws out the money changers and the people selling doves, pigeons, and which were to be used for sacrifice. we have to remember that the situation is one where there is no division between politics and religion as far as the Jews were concerned. The two are the same. If you look at the Old Testament, you'll see in the book of Leviticus all the instructions for how life is to be lived. There is no separation, as we have it, between religion and political life and daily life. It's all one. And so the challenge that Jesus gives to the religious rulers is both religious and at the same time political. Now, they accuse him of betraying God. And if that were the only accusation, because they say his teaching is, let's just say, different, if that's the only accusation, then they could have had him stoned. That was quite within their ability to have someone who was a heretic stoned. And we find, in fact, after Jesus' death, that Paul is at the stoning of Stephen. And Stephen is stoned because he was a heretic. And so they could have done that. But it seems that Jesus appealed to rather a lot of people, or his teaching appealed to them. And so they were worried about what would happen if they were the ones that put Jesus to death. That is why they then plot to have Jesus killed on political grounds as king of the Jews, so that the Romans would have seen him as a threat and would have naturally put him away as a terrorist. Jesus doesn't stay in Jerusalem because he's aware that he could be arrested. He stays just outside and comes in during the day. And we are in Jerusalem to celebrate the feast of the Passover. Now, this was the main Jewish feast, celebrating the time when the Jews escaped from Egypt. Now, we need a little diversion here. We are accustomed to judging everything that we read about the past from a historical perspective. This is really quite recent. From the 18th century onwards, history became more important. And we think in historical terms. We think about our ancestors. We go do this ancestry investigation. Where did we come from? Who are we? We want to know the details. And historians compete to discover all the details and get them right. Is this right? Is this exactly what happened? From a historian's point of view, there is no evidence for the exodus from Egypt. In fact, Israeli archaeologists have shown that it is impossible that the 600,000 Jews who were supposed to have spent 40 years in a fairly restricted area, waiting until they could get into the promised land, there would have been evidence of their settlement there. There is no evidence. The historians have looked at the Egyptian records, and the Egyptians were very good at keeping records, and they have found very little evidence that the Jews were ever there. So from a historical point of view, the Exodus never happened. On the other hand, it is the foundation myth of the Jewish religion. And we are not and when we are thinking about the Bible, we are not thinking about history. We are thinking about myth. And for some of us, myth can be more important than history. We are living within a myth. Now we know with the stories about the Buddha's birth and the rest that, again, we're in an area of myth. We are not in an area of history. And it's not important that it should be thought of as a history. It is much more useful to us as myth. So the myth of the Exodus is one of a movement from slavery to freedom, from darkness to light. And it is within that shadow, if you like, that we find Jesus celebrating the Passover meal. Now, having said that about the Exodus, we have to also say this about the New Testament. The books of the New Testament are not histories. They are biographies. Now, just as some people will try and make a pattern out of the past of the person they're writing about, so the writers of the four Gospels also are doing this with Jesus. We need to remember that the first of them, Mark, didn't start writing until about 30 years after Jesus' death. None of the Gospel writers knew Jesus. Paul's letters are written before the Gospels, and Paul had never met Jesus. So we are talking about something which is spiritual and not historical. And from that point of view, then, we need to see what of spiritual importance and value there is in these stories which they are telling us. And if we look at the four Gospels and the account of the last days of Jesus, they are different. John in particular has a different message from the other three, whom we call the synoptic Gospels, who share a certain amount of material. So we come to Thursday, Maundy Thursday, and Jesus and his disciples are gathered in an upper room to celebrate the Passover feast. And John tells us that at this meal, Jesus takes a bowl of water and a towel and washes the disciples' feet. This they find quite difficult, and particularly Peter. Peter objects. He says, no, you can't do this to me. You can't do this to me. I can do it to you, but, this is the act of a servant. Jesus says to Peter, you can't be a follower of mine unless you are prepared to have your feet washed. And then Peter says, well, I want the whole of me washed. He's that sort of person, it's all or nothing. He immediately grasps the future, as it were, and wants to be part of it. So he will have the whole of himself washed, and he will never betray Jesus. And Jesus then says, of course, as we know, when the cock has crowed twice, you will have betrayed me 3 times. And Peter doesn't accept that. Well, at this meal is also sitting Judas. Now, Judas is an interesting character, and I have always felt that from a spiritual point of view, we should try and find the best interpretation of his actions and not cast him as the devil. Because I don't think that Judas was evil. I think he was mistaken. His name, Iscariot, probably means knife carrier. And that would have indicated that he was a zealot. James and John were also, the sons of thunder, were also thought to be zealots. Now, the zealots were a very strict religious group who believed in terrorism, that the kingdom would only come when the Romans were driven out. And they were behind most of the revolts that took place. Now, from his point of view, what I think, and this is my interpretation, what I think happened was that he believed that when the authorities confronted Jesus, angelic powers would come to his aid, and the final war that was going to lead to the arrival of the kingdom was going to take place. But that Jesus was avoiding the confrontation and that he would promote it. And if we look at the little conversations that go on with him, we see it can be taken as Jesus approving of what he is going to do. Go and do what you have to do. Well, what did he have to do? And was that Jesus approving of it, or was it just Jesus getting rid of him from the table? We don't know. But if Judas felt that things needed to be brought to a head, and as treasurer, he could make a little bit of a profit out of it, 30 pieces of silver, then that was what he would do. And he thought this was a cunning plot. Jesus was going to face this confrontation. Jesus was going to win. The angelic powers would be with him, and they would be 30 quid in. It doesn't happen like that. But I think that is the explanation for Jesus' suicide after Jesus is crucified. Why does Judas commit suicide? Only because things had not gone as he planned. I don't think he expected that Jesus would be crucified. So we have these two, Peter and Judas, each reacting in a very different way to the death of Jesus. Peter getting a second wind, as it were, and Judas committing suicide. When Jesus is taken before the chief priests, the two trials, all sorts of accusations are made and they don't really hold water. But they take him to Pilate and say, well, he claims to be the king of the Jews. Now, Jesus never actually claimed to be the king of the Jews, but he doesn't deny it. That sort of kingship that his disciples might have believed in was not the same kingship that the Roman authorities would have believed in, but Pilate puts on the cross, King of the Jews, a label, King of the Jews. So that we would take to be the reason why he is treated as a terrorist and killed as a terrorist and put on a cross. It wasn't unusual. There were hundreds of people who were crucified. And this crucifixion brings us to the whole business of nonviolence. Because what has happened is that Jesus has challenged the religious and political authorities, not in a physical way, but in a spiritual way. He has challenged the whole teaching of those who ran the temple, Pharisees, Sadducees, priests. He challenges their whole way of thinking. He opposes the sacrifice in the temple. And this is a terrific condemnation of the way that the Jews practiced their religion. You got forgiven by sacrificing an animal. It depends on the sin as to how important the animal was. Was it a dove or was it a lamb? But animals are sacrificed to bring people into a better relationship with their God. What happens after the crucifixion is the temple is destroyed and animal sacrifice ceases, as Jesus had wanted. And so some Christians will, well, most Christians will say Jesus was the final sacrifice, that his life was given for the purification of the religion which the Jews practiced. Or is it a new religion? This is a difficult one to answer, and people will take different views of it. My own view is that what Jesus initiates divides his followers into two. There are those who remain in Jerusalem and, as it were, act as a reformed Judaism, meeting daily in the temple. And there are those with Paul who are taking the message out to people in the Gentile world. And they reform or express this teaching in different ways that are relevant to the societies in which they are moving and living. Now, this crucifixion seems to be an end. Jesus is dead. The authorities will hope that the whole business that he represented will be forgotten. And the disciples return north. They don't even stay to see the crucifixion. It is only the women who stand watching Jesus die. Now, Jesus' death is an ultimate sacrifice, an act of non-violence. And as we know from more recent acts of non-violence, like those of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, whose death we celebrate today, we know that these acts of non-violence lead to a real, or can lead to a real change in society. The disciples don't realize this until afterwards. And what happens on Easter Day will depend on the gospel that we're reading, but I will give you two things that happen. First of all, Mary Magdalene and others go to the tomb, and they find the stone that had sealed it up rolled away and the tomb empty. And Mary Magdalene is very worried. And she sees a man whom she takes to be a gardener and says, "What have you done with the body? What have they done with the body? Where is it gone? Where is it buried? Is it buried, or what has happened to it?" Now this figure then says, "Mary." And it's at that spoken word that she recognizes him. Now, if this were Jesus, why does Mary not recognize the physical person that she is seeing? Why is it only when the word is spoken that she understands who it is? A second event, two disciples are on their way to Emmaus. They're walking on the road, and they're joined by a stranger who asks them what they're doing, what has happened. And they say, "Well, don't you know?" And they tell him about the crucifixion of Jesus. And this figure then explains to them, probably with reference to the suffering servant of Isaiah, as to why it was that Jesus had to die. This non-violent act. It seems that they don't have any questions about this person who has joined them. But when they're sitting at table, he takes a loaf of bread and he breaks it and shares it. And it is in the sharing of bread that they recognize the figure as being Jesus. Now, these appearances are not to be taken literally. They tell us two stories. The first is that it is in hearing our name that we recognize who Jesus is, that we are spoken to by a voice and by name, and it's personal and it's individual. And secondly, that the act of sharing, of breaking bread, has become, and it became for Christians, almost the center of their religious celebrations together. They broke bread, they shared, they were a community. They take refuge in the community and they share between them this physical life, not just ideas, but life itself. And so out of these appearances, we get the idea of resurrection. But that idea of resurrection is very, very fuzzy. Let's say fuzzy. We don't really know what it means. And there's no point, as Thay said, in spending time trying to work out what it is. All we know is that the spirit that was alive in Jesus remains there after his death, and that the authorities have not killed the spirit, but the spirit lives. And the spirit is communicated. It is communicated through the way we speak, through that word, that calling each individual by their name. We are called by our name. And by the fact that we do not exist solely as spiritually alone, we are part of a Sangha. We have to share. We have to together understand the spiritual life. We have to help each other develop our spirituality. We don't do it on our own. We may be part of a tradition, but tradition is never static. Tradition is always moving, is always changing. Our tradition always has to find new ways of expressing itself, because the society in which we live is different. Thay said that if Buddha had lived at the time when Jesus lived, he probably would have been crucified. And that would, what would that have meant? The Spirit enables us, encourages us, allows us to act differently in the age in which we live. And I think in this age now, when the religious people of all sorts and denominations are in a minority, and we live in an atheistic society, they say at the next census, there will be fewer than half the people putting down a religious affiliation. We live in a materialist society that doesn't share our values, and we have more in common as Christians and Buddhists and Muslims. We have more in common than we have with the materialism and those who support it, encourage it, tell us we have to invest, tell us we have to earn more, do more. And it may be that what we have to do is to suffer more. But that suffering is creative if it is that we are suffering on behalf of a spirituality which lives within us, that lightens our lives. And so I pray that together we may resist the values of those who rule us and the values of those who encourage us to be consumers of all the things that actually have a real hollowness. They will not feed us.
Thank you so much, Colin. I know I've learned a lot, and you agreed earlier that we would invite questions now, straight after the talk. So I invite anybody that would like to ask a question, either to put it in the chat or, and I hope that our 3 tech people are going to keep an eye on the screen, or to wave your hand, or I think there's an option to kind of raise a digital hand as well. So if anybody has a question for Colin to answer, then please feel free to do that now. And then after a little time for that, we'll have a short break, and then opportunity to share in smaller groups. So I invite your questions and look forward to hearing them. allow people to unmute themselves, or is that getting too complicated? This is the part that always gives me. Yes, Mary Moran. I don't think I can unmute you. You have, yeah, you are. Okay, please go ahead.
Thank you, Colin, for that beautiful talk on this Easter morning. I'm a Catholic and have studied and worked, lived in Plum Village. So I'm very imbued with the teaching of Thay. But a number of years ago, this is not so much a question as a sharing, when you said we do not know what the resurrection means. As a child growing up, I just thought it was that Jesus somehow was raised from the dead in some magical way. But a number of years ago, when I went through a very existential crisis with a lot of deep suffering and big challenges to my faith, where I struggled very, very much with, not with God so much as with the church and many things, and couldn't find meaning in what I myself was going through. So after a number of years, when I kind of did emerge, and there was a time where I even said, if you gave me a choice and asked me, did I want to live or did I want to die? I would have said, I want to die. So when I came through this time, I was actually in Colorado, and I had come down from a trek on the mountains with a group of spiritual seekers. And when I was coming down, I said, God, I want to live. And I began to thank God for life. When I saw the enormity of the Colorado mountains and realized that any suffering I had was minute when compared to God's creation. But after that, the Easter story took on a very personal meaning to me, where I felt I had died to much of what I had formerly believed, and where I had gone through hell to redeem my own lost soul and come out saying, I want to live. That was for me a kind of a lived experience. And then the whole story of the passion, death, going down into hell to redeem the lost souls, and the resurrection took on an incredibly personal meaning for me. And I believe a lot of people do go through that experience of deep suffering, meaninglessness, death, hell, and then somehow resurrection and light. So I guess I just wanted to share that. You brought it up for me with that beautiful talk. Thank you.
Thank you for your sharing, Mary. And there's a question in the chat now, Colin, that I think it would be nice for you to answer, if you would. This is from Justin. Yeah. He says, thank you, Colin. I wonder if you could make some reference to loving kindness, metta, of Jesus's teachings, and how we can learn from this as practitioners. I guess you will be aware of the loving kindness meditation that's offered to first ourselves and then to people around us, and then boundless love to humanity or to all beings. So that's the root of our loving kindness meditation. And Justin wonders whether you could talk a little bit about that as far as your, as far as Christianity goes. Thank you.
Well, the Jesus' summary of the commandments was love God and love your neighbor, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, that commandment to love your neighbor as you love yourself is really quite a challenge, because we do all sorts of things for ourselves, don't we? And we don't do nearly so many for our neighbors. But the challenge is to love them as we love ourselves, and to be therefore aware of their needs. And of course, Jesus' main ministry was a healing ministry, healing both physically and mentally, and a preaching of forgiveness. And the idea that we are forgiven can be healing. Not only that we are forgiven, but that we forgive. And if we are forgiving, if we are living so that we don't let the sun go down on our anger, if we are open to other people, if we are not judgmental, then we are following Jesus' main teaching, which is in the Sermon on the Mount. And if you read the Sermon on the Mount, which is chapters 5 to 8 of St. Matthew's Gospel, you'll find there a huge amount about how we should respond to other people. We have the parable of the Good Samaritan, which I think is known by people of most religions, the idea that we go to whatever extent is required to help other people when we see them in trouble. So I think this is the loving kindness. And as we know ourselves, that in order to respond, we have to stop thinking about ourselves. We become servants. So we can't do this from above. A servant does it from below. When Jesus is washing the feet of the disciples, he is acting, not only acting as a servant, he is being a servant. And it's very interesting to me that the Vietnamese word for I, Thay, means your servant. Your servant. I am your servant. So it is in this serving that we express that loving kindness. We can't think of loving kindness as being a warm feeling. That is sentimentality, and it's a mistake. Loving kindness demands of us. It's not about feeling good about ourselves. It's about worrying that we haven't done enough. That is loving kindness.
Thank you, Colin. I think we could have one more before we have a break. I can't see everybody. So if you'd like
I got a message from somebody asking about the Exodus.
If you'd like to answer that, Colin, then let's do it.
I mean, it's basically some information. The Exodus is a story at the beginning of the Old Testament. The book is in fact called Exodus. The story is that a number of Jews were held in Egypt, helping to build, acting as slaves, and that Moses manages to lead them out of that. And there are all sorts of stories which, if you attend a Jewish Passover meal, are lived through at that meal. The plagues and all the reasons why Pharaoh won't let them go. But anybody who knows about myths or even fairy tales will know that the structure of these stories is of the same ilk. Now, this doesn't mean they're not important. I mean, if you take fairy stories, we have, for instance, the story of Red Riding Hood. Now, what does the story of, why do we have that story of Red Riding Hood? Is it not a message to young girls about the dangers that they may have to face? So we've used fairy tales in this way, and there's no reason why we shouldn't go on to use myths in a similar way. And so the story of the Exodus, I think, is a myth, but a very profound myth, which has allowed people to face all sorts of tribulations and to lead them from, as I said, from darkness to light.
Thank you, Colin. One more, a question. Ooh, nobody else got any questions, but I can only see 25 people at once. No? Well, am I right, tech people? I can't see anybody.
No, Terry, there's one in the box, which is, can you explain how Jesus is a Buddhist spiritual ancestor?
Oh, yes, that's a good one, Colin. Would you like to answer that for somebody?
How can I explain how?
Can you read it out again, Justin? I've lost it now.
Can you explain how Jesus is a Buddhist spiritual ancestor?
Oh.
Well, Thay said that we have equal ancestors. I mean, he was very interested in the similarities between Buddhism and Christianity, and he himself had a statue of the Buddha and a picture of Jesus on his altar. And he saw them both as spiritual ancestors, maybe with a slightly different emphasis. The thing is that we can't just live as Christ lived or as Buddha lived, that they both have something to say to us, coming from slightly different positions. But for us in the West, our whole culture is saturated with Christianity. If you go into our galleries, art galleries, many pictures will be Christian and not Buddhist. Many of the songs that we sing, much of the music that we listen to, Bach in particular, will have a Christian background to it. So I think even though we may not accept it consciously, that unconsciously we are affected by the tradition which comes from Jesus, as well as other traditions. We can't, as it were, put ourselves into a box. I can't say I'm completely Christian, and you can't say you're completely Buddhist, because we have all sorts of ancestor. I mean, we've also got, as we know, we've got our parents. Can I say something about Christian stewardship of the earth and creation? I have a message from Hannah.
Yes.
Well, Yes, I mean, I think that Francis of Assisi's song, Canticle of the Sun, expresses it extremely well. That everything that we have around us is to be valued, is to be celebrated, and we are part of it. We can't, I mean, I have to go into my Buddhist phase, if you like. I stand in front of a tree. I breathe out carbon dioxide. The tree breathes in the carbon dioxide. The tree breathes out oxygen, and I breathe in oxygen. We are interrelated, and I don't see that as being unusual for a Christian to accept either. The creation is ours to look after. We are part of that creation. There is no way in which we can continue to exploit it. It's there for our use, but it's also for we are stewards. I mean, a Christian would accept we are stewards. We have a responsibility, and we have to exercise that responsibility. And it has now come to a crisis, a critical time, when we just have to do that.
Thank you, Colin. I know I said one more, but that's because you never know how long they're going to be or how long the answers
You
are.
don't, no.
So I've got one more.
This shows a certain amount of lack of perspicacity.
Okay. Oh, now it's gone. No, here it is.
If you've already asked this, if you've only recently been able to join, but a couple of.
Have you got that one? I think of Christ as a Bodhisattva. What does Colin think Jesus was trying to do spiritually for all of us on the cross? And then we will break after this one.
First of all, he accepted what was in store for him, even though it meant a terrible death. So in pursuing the truth, his spiritual truth, that's where it ended for him. And what the challenge is for Christians is that we have also to face the possibility of being crucified. And we may be crucified by our society. I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which we can be, as it were, crucified. And what he does is to show that that is not the end. I mean, we heard from Mary how her life was transformed and she felt a resurrection. She came out, and that feeling was a feeling of resurrection. And so his message, I think, is that even when we have to go through these things, these terrible times, there is a path through to a feeling, or a positive feeling, a resurrection.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you everybody for your wonderful questions and comments.